the good old summertime, in the good old summertime.
So let's actually talk about MacLaren, the batsman. You've written an article, which again I would point my listeners to. It's titled "The Excuses Begin to Run Thin: MacLaren as Batsman and Captain." So, how would you describe MacLaren as a batsman? Was he attacking? Was he defensive? And do you think he complied simply with what an amateur batsman should be like?
His style was very much this is how you are taught to bat in a public school, and it was all about style. The main shots that he was famous for were drives and a hook shot, and it's the one that Neville Cardus repeatedly talked about. He was always talking about it. Whenever somebody played a hook shot, he always compared it to MacLaren. He said that he didn't hook the ball; he dismissed it from his presence, um, which is quite a way to put it. The
It's a beautiful phrase, like so much of Cardis, but in terms of like building up McLaren perhaps better than he was, yes, it's quite ridiculous.
And you can see because there's quite a few photographs that George Beldam took for the Great Batsman book in 1905, and he took a lot of McLaren. You do get a sense, if you kind of line them up, you get a sense of the way that he played, and it's very extravagant, sort of a drive with a massive follow through. Um, a modern cricketer might say we looks a bit stiff. And to be honest, there were people who wrote about him kind of while he was still playing that weren't convinced that he was this great stylist. He said he was a bit kind of cramped and always just shoveling the ball on the leg side and stuff like that. So it wasn't a unanimous opinion that he was this glorious, gorgeous looking batsman. Um, but he did attack. That was his main approach. He could defend and he could play a very different game if he had to do, but that wouldn't have been his kind of default way of playing. I think as well, not just McLaren, but all of the leading amateurs, they almost had to play in a certain way. If he had played the way that professionals played, where he was cautious and he didn't take risks, he wouldn't have had the reputation that he had, and he wouldn't have probably got as far as he could because he just didn't play like that. And it was almost the case that the amateurs, like McLaren, like Jackson, their job was to go out there and look good. They were to play all the shots. They were to entertain the crowds. While the professionals, it was their job to do the dirty work. So when it was a horrible pitch, they were the ones that had to stay there. They were the ones that had to block. They were the ones that had to score ones and twos. And then the amateurs could come in and get all the glory. But the strange thing about McLaren, because he did have a reputation of being able to play on bad wickets, but his record doesn't quite back that up because he had an incredible record in Australia, um, but not so much in England. And if you compare him to other players, his average doesn't stand out. Um, there is an argument that conditions at Old Trafford were always hard for batting, which is true. But then you've got Johnny Tilsley in the same team, who was a professional, and his record's much better than McLaren's. But obviously, although he's got a good reputation, he never had the glory of McLaren because he was a professional. And so I think his reputation was doing a lot of work. But then at the same time, um, people did rate him very highly. As I said earlier, that Sidney Barnes said he was a very good batter. Sidney Barnes changed his mind quite a few times about who was the best he'd ever bowled to, but he did say at one point that McLaren was one of the best he'd ever bowled to.
Hmm.
But then you've got the times when he was like, genuinely made a massive impression. So the most obvious one is the 424 against Somerset. And that's what made him famous. And as you said, it's still a record for an English cricketer. But the Somerset attack was, I think calling it threadbare would be generous. There were people bowling who did not normally bowl, and there was a 17-year-old that was a key part of the attack, and it was a very, very weak side, and it was a very small ground and very flat conditions. You've still got to score them, but it wasn't exactly a difficult attack. And his other really famous innings was in 1903. Um, it was for the gentleman against the players, and he scored 168 not out. His team had followed on, and he and CB Fry scored a partnership of just over 300, I think it was, and kind of saved the game. Then, if you look at that, not only was it very flat conditions, but Sydney Barnes was actually part of the players' attack, and he'd gone off injured after bowling 1 over in the second innings. And when MacLaren came in, Fry and Ranji had already had a massive stand, so it's kind of like the bowling was broken, and then he just came in and played these amazing shots. But that's what got remembered. It was kind of supposed to be one of the greatest partnerships of the golden age, this partnership between MacLaren and Fry, but it was against a kind of decimated attack that had already been bowling all day. I think as well that he liked, as a batter, he liked everything in his favour. The most obvious one is that he was, for some reason, he absolutely hated the googly. He thought it was unethical. He thought it was unfair, and he argued that it prevented batsmen from playing the shots. It was almost like, how can I play my amazing drives if I don't know which way the ball's going to turn? So he was always opposed to the googly, and he carried this on long after everybody else had said, yeah, it's a great thing, is the googly. Then there's another story. It's another Carter story. So how true it is another question. But he was supposedly batting against Australia, and the Australian captain, Joe Darling, had packed the leg side against him. And supposedly MacLaren went to Darling and said, look, why are you doing this? How can I play my famous hook shot when you've got all these fielders in the way? And Darling said, well, you can't tell me where to put my field. And then so MacLaren just started hitting. Cardiff doesn't really say, but I think the implication is he hits into the offside where there's all the space. And then Darling changes his mind and he spreads the field. And then MacLaren says to him, all right, that's fine. Now we can get on with the game. It's like, no, you're not doing that. I have got to be able to play my shots. The other one that says a lot about him was in the 1905 Ashes, because in the first test, England had struggled in the first innings against the fast bowler Tibby Cotter, and they'd managed to get a first innings lead, but all the English players were a little bit, this Cotter is a bit quick. And again, according to Cardus, so we have to take it with a pinch of salt, MacLaren was seen walking up and down in the pavilion going, Cotter, I'll bloody Cotter him. And the England captain, Jackson, put him into open with the explicit instruction of hit the bowlers off the length. And MacLaren, he kind of went berserk for a couple of hours and he was just scoring really, really quickly. He calmed down a bit afterwards, and it made Darling go completely on the defensive. But then, during that, Warwick Armstrong, to slow things down, he started bowling leg theory. So he was bowling his leg breaks outside leg stump, and MacLaren didn't like it at all. And he kicked them away, wouldn't have anything to do with them. And when he was at the other end, he was just kind of just leaning on his bat handle. I think someone said he was sitting on his bat handle. He was just absolutely disapproving. So it had to be just how he wanted it. And if it wasn't, he could be a little bit grumpy. But I think the thing about MacLaren and his reputation, that innings in 1905, he scored 140, but it was his only test century in England. He never made another one. He'd never made one before. So the reputation and the reality didn't really match up.
Yeah, and he seemed to have a particular love of the Sydney cricket ground, both test and first-class matches he played there, which again is interesting. It's not traditionally a batsman's pitch. Thank you for that quite brilliant analysis. There's a lot to think about with his batting. Your view of the Somerset bowlers from 1895 when he scored his quadruple century made me laugh, because I'm sure that analysis is not what Archie MacLaren would have said of the bowlers. He probably would have said they were top class, and used it when he spoke about his famous 424 for many decades. Back to the Beldam photographs, Giles. I'm glad you brought those up, because of all the photos in the Beldam book from 1905, I actually really adore those of Archie MacLaren. I feel like there's a great variety in the photos, but to your specific point about how you see him driving and pulling, so many of those shots of him driving, you can ascertain how much of an attacking batsman he was because there's a slight blur and a curve of the bat, which speaks to the stock photography that Belden was employing. So these weren't just staged photos where they were holding the bat in position. He was actually hitting a ball. Now, it wasn't during a match, but still, these batsmen were attempting to recreate what they would have done. And with MacLaren, you get a sense of the force with which he's hitting the ball because of the curve of the bat, which to me is fascinating. And that's why I get a lot from the Belden photographs of MacLaren. You don't get that blur or curve with some of the more famous photos like of Trumper. Let's return to his supposed chip on his shoulder when it comes to his amateur status. Uh, Basically, because of his education, and he doesn't quite have enough money when compared to the other amateurs that he's playing with and against. What was MacLaren's relationship like with the MCC and the general cricket establishment? Did he acquiesce with the status quo, or was he capable of ruffling a few feathers at Lord's?
He was quite insecure around Lords. One he used to say that he felt he would get six of the best if he used the wrong door. So he was always a little bit uncertain around it. Um, and I think what he used to do, because he was aware that he couldn't live like a lot of the MCC members and the MCC committees, and he almost used to overcompensate and come across as really high-handed, and that didn't go down well at Lords. The main figure that he clashed with would have been Lord Hawke, um, and the two never really saw eye to eye, and the two flashpoints came about overseas tours, and in those days, until 1903 or four, all tours by England cricketers to Australia were privately organised. And there was a growing movement that, well, actually, it should be the MCC that's responsible for these. And when MacLaren took a team out in 1901-02, he did get a little bit of criticism, including from Hawke, saying that, well, no, it shouldn't be you taking these teams out; it should be the MCC. And that's why on his tour he didn't have Wilfred Rhodes or George Hurst on the team, because Lord Hawke effectively said, "No, you're not going." Um, and then when the 1903-04 tour happened, the Melbourne Cricket Club had originally asked MacLaren to bring out a team, but he couldn't get the players that he wanted, and so that's when they went to the MCC in at Lords saying, "Can you bring out a team?" And the MCC very deliberately went straight past MacLaren and went to ask Pelham Warner, who was very much their yes man. His face fitted perfectly. And so MacLaren not really lost the captaincy because it didn't quite work like that, but he was very publicly snubbed by the MCC, which he didn't like. And that slightly messy relationship with Lord Hawke, it meant that because Lord Hawke was quite often a selector of the test team, it made for a quite fraught relationship. And it caused quite a few problems over the years. But it wasn't just with England that there was a bit of a tension when MacLaren was at Lords. The In 1907, MacLaren was still captain of Lancashire, and they went to Lords to play Middlesex. And the first day, there was a little bit of play, but it was basically washed out. And they came back the next day to start again, and the pitch was waterlogged. So the umpire said, right, that there won't be any play. The crowd weren't very happy, and they came onto the pitch to protest a little bit, and then they all went away. The MCC offered some, I think, like free passes. Say, come back tomorrow. It's fine. We'll make it up to you. And third day came, and MacLaren refused to play. He made a statement to the press saying that the pitch had been deliberately torn up, and the wicket couldn't be put right. So I'm not playing under these conditions. Now he got no right to do that. It was the umpires who made the call, but they seem to have just kind of gone along with MacLaren. He's probably berated them somewhere until they've agreed, and everybody was up in arms. That the Middlesex people were furious. The MCC were furious. Pelham Warner was very critical in the press. Surprise, surprise. But that says everything about his attitude to Lord. It's I am not going to be cowed by you. I'm not going to take it.
It's quite admirable, really. But again, we're thinking and viewing this from a century later. We've already discussed his quite interesting, unusual relationship with the other amateurs in which he played and associated. But what was his relationship that we know of with the professionals, especially as captain? Like, did he look down on them, or was he quite agreeable? What do we know about MacLaren's relationship with professional cricketers?
To be honest, there's not an awful lot that we do know because he never really spoke about them. And just because of the way that things were back then, none of the professionals really said much about him, not even in later years. The only one who did talk about him a little bit was Sydney Barnes. Um, for example, he said that because MacLaren had kind of backed him to play for England, he felt when he was playing for Lancashire that he owed it to MacLaren. But the two of them don't seem to have got on that well. I think my favourite line, which probably was never said, and it's one of those that no matter how hard you look, you can't actually find where it was originally said or who's claiming it happened. But the story is that when Barnes was in Australia with MacLaren's team in 1901-02, at some point on the journey, it depends which version you read, they were caught in a rough sea and they were all really kind of bit worried by it, feeling seasick. And MacLaren supposedly said, "At least if we go down, that bugger Barnes will go down with us." So they didn't get along that well. But in terms of the others, it is hard to say. He wasn't the worst. In fact, in some ways, he seems to have been a little bit more accepting of professionals than most, in that he would listen to their opinions on the field. He wouldn't let them do what they wanted, but he would listen. He would certainly have looked down on them. He wasn't that far ahead of his time. He would have looked down on them as from social reasons. But a lot of the professionals did respect him just because he was clearly very knowledgeable. And there's a few of the Lancashire players from the 1920s when he was coach for the second time. And they spoke about him a little bit, and they said he was brusque and he could be a bit aloof, like everybody said, but that once he sort of relaxed a little bit, he was never jolly and friendly, but he was a bit more approachable. And all of them said about his tactical knowledge and also his coaching ability to improve them. And he's not one of those players that there are stories about how badly he treated professionals or anything like that. That there might be a few little hints. The obvious one comes from Joe Darling, actually, in something he wrote about how he didn't like the way that the amateur captains spoke to the professionals. But that's not definitely about MacLaren, and it's more likely to be about Stanley Jackson,
Mm.
who he's got a few things to say about and the way that he treated his professionals. So it's not really clear cut. There's not really um, much evidence for either side of it, to be honest. Just that he was respected and fairly respectful.
That Darling comment in particular, I find quite insightful, and also, as you say, just as telling as what you think he's saying about Stanley Jackson, because Darling captained Ashes series against both of them, so he was probably in a good position to make that call.
You is, darling. Ooh, your friends. My sweet. You surely have them cuckoo eyes, the kind, the ones that hypnotize. Now, who's your friend? Lovey. Who's your friend? Yes, you. Before we go, we better let them know that we're both good friends.
Giles, let's sort of sum up his captaincy overall. This is Archie MacLaren we're speaking of course, because you've written extensively about him as a captain, and in particular you did a deep dive into the 1902 Ashes series and sort of a re-evaluation of how he led the team. So in a nutshell, what sort of captain was MacLaren, both as a tactician but also as a leader of men?
As a tactician, he was very good. He was excellent at setting fields. He was one of those captains like Joe Darling and like Harry Trott, who had started to realise that a captain could really make a difference by where they put the fielders. There were only so many things you could do as a captain back then, because you couldn't declare except in certain circumstances for most of the 1890s. And bowling changes, especially in England. I think it was slightly different in Australia, but in England, it was very much a case that you had your two main bowlers, whatever the team was, you put them on and they bowled until they dropped. And change bowling wasn't really a thing. It was just give them a bit of a rest. And for example, when MacLaren was captain of Lancashire, if you look at the bowling figures each season, there were two bowlers that did all the work. It was Arthur Mould and Johnny Briggs. They just took all the wickets. It was put them on and just let them do the thing. But where he shone was in field placings, and there's quite a few examples, including in the 1902 Ashes, where he's kind of got a wicket just by placing a fielder in just the right place. Where he was less effective was how he dealt with people. He was a bit too fond of just saying what he thought. If he thought that a player wasn't very good, he would quite happily say, well, they're not very good. He would even criticise the selectors in the press for the players that they'd sent him. And I think when you look at the players that he had, and you look at his results as captain, and then you look at another captain like Stanley Jackson or Pelham Warner, who had pretty much the same players, and the results that they had against Australia, you start to ask, do the tactics make up for the fact that the players didn't really like playing for him? But he did do some things that were ahead of his time. So, for example, he used to like shuffling batting orders around. Now, the kind of cricket establishment didn't like that. They thought, oh no, you don't do that. You leave the batting order as they are. But he was quite happy to change things around. He did start to, especially for the 1902 Ashes, he did start to shuffle bowlers around a lot more. It wasn't just put your best two bowlers on. He'd change the attack. He'd try and shake things up. The problem was that when he was captain, it was all a bit joyless. It was a bit miserable. It was just, we've just got to win. That's all that matters. And he was quite autocratic. It was what he thought, and that was all that mattered. He wouldn't always listen to advice. And it's even if his plan wasn't working, he would stick to it, which caused some slight problems. So he was a good captain and a terrible manager, I think, is the best way to describe him.
And that's a perfect segue into the next question, because I'd love to hear your thoughts again about this 1903-04 conundrum over who was going to captain the MCC side to Australia. There's a couple of lovely cartoons from this period where Fry, Warner, and MacLaren are sort of lined up against a wall like school children, and someone's trying to choose who's going to be the best. And I think the press had a field day. And what's interesting is that we actually have quotes or at least thoughts from both Warner and Fry, what they thought about MacLaren as a captain. Warner considered MacLaren just too negative to be a good captain, and Fry described him as, quote, iron and joyless. Under him, you entered every game bowed down with the Herculean labour of a cricket match against Australia. You went in a trance to your doom. It's pure hyperbole from Fry, but typical CB Fry. I mean, do you think these assessments are fair, or does it speak more to this really difficult relationship between the three men?
I think that it's mainly for those two in particular. It was a massive personality clash. Um, so, for example, Fry, he wrote a lot about McLaren as captain, and he wrote a huge amount about the 1902 Ashes. But my favourite thing about Fry is that the things he wrote about, he wasn't there for.
Yes.
He's entirely made it up. Like he talks about the selection meeting for the fourth test, he wasn't there. He's talking about the advice he gave, he wasn't there. And I think what he likes to do, kind of put the blame onto McLaren for the 1902 Ashes and kind of overlook the fact that he was terrible in it and he got dropped. So I think there's a little bit of that going on there. And the other thing is that Fry and McLaren were temperamentally very different. And they were so different from the background and the way they thought about cricket and the way they thought about life in general that they were never going to agree on what you should be like as an amateur captain. But the problem is that Fry himself was frankly an appalling captain. So I think when he's criticising McLaren's captaincy, he's overlooking the fact that yes, he won the triangular tournament in 1912, but in the circumstances, that wasn't a great achievement because he was up against, for various reasons, two very weak teams. And some of the things that he did as captain over the years were just bizarre. They made no sense whatsoever. But even Fry had to admit that McLaren was good because I can't remember when he said it, but he said that when you played against a team led by McLaren, you felt like you were playing against a brain. Like there was something that was leading. It wasn't just a random collection of players. There was an intelligence guiding everything that they did. In terms of Warner, um, they were basically at war. They just did not like each other. Um, I think Warner liked to make sure that everybody knew that he was a very successful captain, and Warner's great talent was promoting Pelham Warner, and he had a good record as captain, but his style was very different. There was no kind of tactical vision, which McLaren had. With Warner, it was more a case of let the players do it. It's up to them. So, for example, when Warner became captain in 1903-04, apart from upsetting a lot of Australian officials and just generally making himself unpopular, he tended to let his players just get on with it. So, for example, Wilfred Rhodes would sort out his own fields. And when it was Bernard Bosanquet, when he won the fourth test, it was just a case of, oh, let's give the ball to him and see what happens. There was no deep scheme behind it in the way there might be for McLaren. I think for both of them as well, Fry was a strange man, I think is the only way to describe him. And Warner was quite chirpy, quite optimistic, and he liked to get on with it. He did get on very well with everybody. He liked to make people happy. Whereas McLaren was more likely to say what he thought. He wouldn't dress it up. He was a pessimist. He was always talking about his bad luck and how terrible things were and how this team's awful. And so you've got that clash. So I think when you're taking the view of what they thought of McLaren's captaincy, they're coming at the idea of what a captain should do and what a captain should be from a completely different direction. And I think MacLaren, in some ways, was quite modern in outlook in that he saw the result as everything. And it kind of coincided with the time when test matches became huge. They'd always been quite big, but round about the turn of the century, they became massive. And all the players that played in them talked about the pressure of facing Australia and the pressure of the public expectations. And the newspapers made a big deal of everything. And MacLaren, even if he didn't succeed very much, he did tap into that idea that no, it's about the result. It's about getting a win. These are huge matches. These are massively important. And Warner and Fry wouldn't have agreed with that. They were a bit more old-fashioned amateur. It's about how you play. It's about having fun. So it's just a completely different perspective. And I think it was that pessimism that affected how a lot of people thought about him. And I think you could argue that for a captain, it's not a good look if you're always thinking the worst is going to happen. You're always cursing your luck and you're cursing the selectors. But I don't think either of those two were in much of a position to criticise.
And it's interesting with that 1903-04 tour, which the MCC or England do win the series, captained by Pelham Warner, Plum Warner. Warner then writes, is it the book How We Won Back the Ashes, which I think became a quite a famous cricket book, a bestseller, and probably just had that. He was holding that almost over MacLaren and to an extent Fry. He would have had that nice feather in his cap. And that book is still used by historians. I'm sure you know it well, Giles. Warner's memoirs from that very important tour.